It was supposed to be a celebration, the night Daniel finally became the man he always said he would be. The restaurant shimmered with gold light, a place where everything gleamed, the chandeliers, the laughter, even the people. I sat at the far end of the marble table next to Daniel, though somehow it felt like miles away. The table stretched endlessly, lined with his partners, their wives, their practiced smiles. Champagne glasses clinked in a rhythm that didn't belong to me. I wore the dress Daniel had chosen, midnight blue silk that draped too perfectly. It wasn't me. It never really was. "Amelia," one of his partners said, leaning across the table. "You must be so proud of him." I smiled. "Of course." Daniel's hand found my knee beneath the table. Not a gesture of affection, but control. A warning. When I tried to join their conversation about markets and acquisitions, his fingers pressed lightly, and he leaned toward me, whispering, "You don't need to say anything, darling. Just look beautiful." The words sliced through me like ice water. The others didn't even notice. They laughed, toasted, carried on. Only I felt the sting. My face burned, but I swallowed it down, painting a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The sound of laughter clattered around me, metallic and hollow. I looked at Daniel, his posture perfect, his smile sharp. He was born for these rooms, for these circles of polished greed and invisible cruelty. I used to think I was too. But that night, I felt like the empty chair at his side. There, but unseen. Later, in the mirror of the women's restroom, I barely recognized myself. My lipstick was perfect, my hair still in place. I looked exactly how he wanted me to look, expensive and silent. As I reapplied my lipstick, the door creaked open. Daniel's assistant, Elise, stepped inside. She didn't see me standing in the corner near the stalls. She pulled out her phone, her voice low and quick. "Yes," she whispered. "He's with her tonight. But it won't be for long. He's already looking for a way out. He said she's too sensitive for his world." The air thickened. My hand froze mid-motion. My throat went dry. She laughed softly, a sound like a bell, and left as if she hadn't just detonated a grenade inside my chest. I stood there, staring at the tiled floor, the sound of my heartbeat louder than the jazz music drifting from the dining room. Too sensitive for his world. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was. When I finally stepped back into the dining room, everything felt slightly off. The air heavier, the light harsher. Daniel looked up at me and smiled, oblivious, or pretending to be. His world moved smoothly, untouched by consequence. Mine was cracking, quietly. The drive home was silent. Daniel scrolled through his phone as I stared out the window, the city lights streaking across the glass like ghosts. When we pulled into the driveway, I stayed in the car for a moment, staring at our house, the modern glass facade Daniel loved so much. It looked transparent, but it wasn't. From the outside, you could see in. From the inside, you saw nothing but your own reflection. Inside, he poured himself a drink, humming some old Sinatra tune. "You were quiet tonight," he said, not looking up. "I didn't have much to say," I replied. He smiled, that same careful smile he gave the press. "That's what I like about you, Amelia. You don't try too hard to impress people." He kissed my cheek absently and walked into his office, closing the door behind him. That was the moment I realized I wasn't part of his life anymore. I was part of his image. I wandered through the quiet house, barefoot, the marble floor cold beneath me. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, wood, spice, and something I used to love. In the bedroom, I saw the box on the dresser. White velvet, ribbon tied neatly. My first thought was that it was for me, a peace offering maybe. A reward for my silence. I opened it. Inside lay a stunning emerald necklace, deep green framed by delicate gold. I remembered it. I'd admired it in a magazine once, circled it with my fingertip and shown it to him. He'd smiled and said, "We'll get you something better." But the note inside wasn't addressed to me. It read, "For the woman who makes me feel alive again." Daniel's handwriting. My fingers trembled. I wanted to laugh, or scream, or throw it all out the window, but I just stood there, staring at it. The emeralds caught the dim light, flickering like envy, like deceit. I set it down carefully, as if it might explode. In a way, it already had. I walked to the hallway mirror. My reflection stared back. Same eyes, same face, but something behind them had dimmed. I thought of the dinner, of his words, of Elisa's whisper. Too sensitive for his world. Maybe. But I wasn't blind anymore. I picked up the necklace box, placed it neatly back where I found it, and closed the lid. Then I turned off the lights, one by one until the house was dark. In the quiet, I felt the weight of something ending. Not love, not yet, but the illusion of it. I stood there in the darkness, heart steady now, and whispered to no one, "I'll find out who you gave it to." When I first met Daniel, he was sitting in the corner of a sunlit cafe, half hidden behind a newspaper and a cup of espresso. I remember the way he looked up at me, that easy, confident smile that made you feel seen, even in a crowded room. I was 27, a journalist for a lifestyle magazine. I'd been assigned to write a feature titled "The Self-Made Man, The Rise of Daniel Cole." He was 35 then, newly successful, handsome in that effortless way that made people lean in when he spoke. I came prepared with notes and questions. He came with charm and curiosity. "Tell me about you," he'd said after I asked my first question. "You don't strike me as someone who just writes about other people's dreams." "What's yours?" It was disarming, how he turned the spotlight back on me. I told him I wanted to write something meaningful one day, something that could change lives. He smiled, eyes glinting with admiration. "Then you should spend more time with people who do that," he said. "Let me show you my world." That was the beginning, the first stone he laid in the foundation of what would become my gilded cage. Daniel's world was magnetic. He moved through it with the confidence of someone who believed every door should open for him. I was swept along like a leaf in his current. He took me to art galleries, charity galas, rooftop dinners where every laugh was rehearsed, every compliment a subtle transaction. I told myself I was just observing, like a journalist always does. But soon I stopped taking notes. I started dressing differently. Cleaner lines, higher heels, softer colors, he said suited my temperament. When he proposed, it wasn't a question. It was a declaration. "You and I will build something extraordinary." And for a while, I believed him. I left my job temporarily, planning to return once we settled into married life. But settling never came. Instead, Daniel's company grew, and my role shifted from journalist to what he called Chief Image Architect, a title that sounded impressive, but meant I spent my days arranging dinner parties, choosing outfits, writing speeches he would claim as his own. He'd say, "You make everything look effortless, Amelia. You make me look good." At first I took it as a compliment. Later, it felt like a verdict. Our home sat on a hill overlooking the city, a glass house Daniel designed himself. He used to call it our transparent dream. But the truth was crueler. From the outside, it gleamed like perfection. Inside, I could barely see out. Daniel filled it with art and polished surfaces, things that reflected his success. He said he built it so we could never hide from each other. But he was the one who started closing doors. His office became off-limits, his phone locked with passwords I never knew. Still, I played the part. Smiled when the wives complimented my style, when the men toasted to Daniel's brilliant vision. I was his ornament, perfectly placed, carefully curated and deeply unseen. There was one night, early in our marriage, when my parents came to visit. My father, a retired schoolteacher, had always been cautious of Daniel. He admired his drive but distrusted his arrogance. At dinner, my father asked a simple question. Something about Daniel's business ethics, his rapid expansion. Daniel laughed, a low, dismissive sound that still makes me flinch when I remember it. "Not everyone understands risk and reward," he said. "Some people prefer the safety of small lives." My father's face turned red. My mother reached for his hand under the table. I wanted to say something, but Daniel gave me that look, the one that said, Don't make a scene. After they left, I cried. Daniel came into our bedroom holding a small jewelry box. Inside was a diamond bracelet. Don't take things so personally, he said, brushing my hair back. You're too emotional sometimes. But that's what I love about you. I wore that bracelet the next day, the metal cold against my skin, a reminder of how easily he could rewrite pain into privilege. Over time, my world narrowed to the shape of his shadow. I stopped writing altogether. When old friends reached out, I found excuses not to meet. Daniel's traveling. I'm busy planning the next event. Truthfully, I couldn't bear to answer their questions, the ones that would make me look too closely at what I'd become. Evenings were the hardest. The city glowed beneath our glass walls, but I often felt like I was standing inside a display case, polished, posed, silent. Daniel would walk in late, smelling of cologne and whiskey. Sometimes he'd kiss my forehead. Sometimes he'd go straight to his office. Always, his phone was in his hand. When I asked about his constant trips, he'd smile without looking up. You worry too much, darling. That's why I handle everything. But I started to notice the small cracks. Perfume on his jacket that wasn't mine. Missed calls at odd hours. His laughter in another room that stopped when I entered. He had started building a new empire, one that didn't include me. I still remember the day I found my old camera, tucked in a box in the attic. It was dusty, forgotten, but when I held it, something inside me stirred. A version of myself I hadn't seen in years. I took it outside that evening, photographing the city skyline from our balcony. The reflection of the glass caught my face beside his empire of steel and light. That was when I realized I wasn't part of that world. I was its decoration, every compromise, every silence, every moment I swallowed my own truth. They weren't sacrifices of love. They were bricks in the wall he built to keep me inside, and himself untouchable, and I helped him build it. The first fracture had come weeks ago. The dinner, the assistant, the necklace. But now I saw it all with cruel clarity. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me recently. He'd been erasing me for years, word by word, choice by choice, and I had mistaken the process for devotion. I stood again by the mirror that night, the same one where I'd stared at my reflection after finding that emerald necklace. My hand brushed the faint outline of the diamond bracelet, the one from that long-ago apology. It glittered beautifully in the light. But all I saw was the cost of wearing it, the cost of silence. The night the truth revealed itself didn't come with thunder or drama. It came quietly, like a soft crack running through glass, invisible until the whole pane shivered apart. I was sitting in the study, Daniel's world of sleek furniture and minimalist coldness. The computer hummed softly. I had meant to check the catering invoice for the gala that evening, just another task in the long list of things I did to keep his image spotless. But the folder caught my eye. It wasn't even hidden. Well, buried inside another labeled company expansion photos, 2023. He always thought I wouldn't look too closely, that I was too obedient or too timid. Maybe he was right, until that night. Inside were dozens of pictures. At first I thought they were promotional shots, until I saw her. Elise, his assistant. Her laughter froze mid-frame, her hand on his chest, his arm draped casually around her waist. Hotel balconies, a private jet, sunsets so perfect they looked staged. But what broke me wasn't the images themselves. It was the repetition of intimacy. The same little gestures, the way his head tilted when he listened, the way his fingers brushed her wrist, the same way he used to touch me when we were alone in the kitchen, and the world outside didn't matter. Then I saw it. Around her neck. A diamond necklace, identical to the one I found weeks ago in his drawer, boxed and unsigned. He'd told me it was for a client's wife, a business gesture. I'd even wrapped it for him, like a fool. The air in the room thickened. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, a dull, heavy drum. Every photograph was another betrayal unfolding under cold, artificial light. It wasn't rage at first. It was stillness. A numb, icy quiet. I just sat there, my fingers trembling slightly as I scrolled through each picture, letting the truth press into me like frostbite. When I closed the folder, my reflection flickered on the black screen, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, hair pulled neatly back like the perfect wife I had trained myself to be. I didn't recognize her. I remember standing, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress, and walking to the mirror in our bedroom. The gown I'd chosen for the gala hung ready on the door, a pale silver piece he'd approved weeks ago. "Elegant, not loud," he'd said. "You don't need attention, Amelia. You're the attention." That night I wore it anyway. But this time I added the perfume he hated, the one he said was too heavy, too floral. I wanted the scent to cling to the air around me, to haunt him. The gala began as every one of his events did, with curated perfection. Music, champagne, and the subtle hum of expensive laughter. The glass walls of our home glowed against the city skyline, his empire reflected in every surface. He looked immaculate, of course. Charcoal suit, white pocket square, confidence poured into human form. When he saw me, he smiled, that same rehearsed smile he used for investors and journalists alike. "Perfect, as always," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my cheek. His lips were cool. I smiled back, because that's what ornaments do. They shine, even under fluorescent truth. The night blurred in motions, introductions, speeches, polite applause. I played my part. I laughed at the right times, smiled when spoken to. But my eyes, they followed her. Elise. She wore a black gown with a slit too bold for the occasion. I might have admired her confidence once, but now I saw what he'd built her into. Another extension of his vanity. When Daniel placed a hand on her back as he guided her toward the podium, I felt something in me shift. It wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. That touch was ownership, not affection. He had once done the same to me, and I had mistaken it for love. The guests clapped when he called her the future of the company. My heart didn't break. It caved in quietly, like something collapsing under its own weight. "Amelia," someone whispered beside me. A colleague's wife, her voice soft with pity. "You must be so proud of him." Proud. The word hung there like smoke. I sipped my champagne and felt it burn all the way down. After the last car had pulled away and the music died, silence settled into the house like a ghost. He poured himself a bourbon, the ice cracking faintly in the glass. "You were quiet tonight," he said, his back to me. I watched him. This man I'd built my world around. The man who used to read my drafts, who once told me my words could change people. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded strange in the open space, steady, almost clinical. He didn't turn. "You found it then?" "I found her," I said softly. He exhaled, long and tired. "Don't make this into drama, Amelia. You've had a comfortable life. Don't ruin it now." My pulse spiked. "Comfortable?" He turned then, his expression bored, almost irritated. "You're not like the women in my circle. You wouldn't survive without me. You know that." For a second, the world went silent. The rain had begun outside, gentle against the glass walls. It sounded like the softest applause for the worst performance of my life. "You think I wouldn't survive?" I said, each word measured. He shrugged. "You're emotional. You don't think long-term. You'd fall apart." There it was. The truth behind every correction, every silenced opinion, every dinner where he spoke for me. He didn't love me. He owned the version of me he'd created. Something inside me fractured, not with noise, but with clarity. I reached for my wedding ring. The metal was cold, heavier than I remembered. He watched, confused, as I crossed to him, lifted his glass, and dropped the ring into his bourbon. It sank slowly, glinting once before disappearing beneath the amber. "Then you can keep it," I whispered. "It fits better in your glass than on my hand." He didn't move. I turned, walking barefoot across the marble floor. The night air hit me when I opened the door, cool, wet, cleansing. I stepped out without my shoes, without my coat, without looking back. The rain soaked through my hair, my gown clinging to my skin, heavy with water and release. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of the world on me. Not around me, not controlling me, but mine. Behind me, the glass house shimmered under the storm, every light still burning. It looked beautiful, fragile, and completely hollow. As I walked down the driveway, the diamonds at my ears caught the faint glow of the city lights, tiny reflections of everything I'd lost and everything I might still become. When I left the glass house that night, I didn't plan where to go. My hands were shaking too much to think. I only remember the way the rain blurred the city lights, turning them into streaks of gold and white. I drove until the roads narrowed and the air turned sharp with salt. By dawn, I found myself on the coast. The cottage was small, tucked between dunes and wild grass. The landlord barely looked up when I handed him the cash. "It's quiet here," he said, sliding me the key. Sometimes too quiet. He was right. The first few days were silence and sea. I woke to the sound of gulls, not Daniel's voice dictating his schedule. I made instant coffee in chipped mugs, sat on the front steps, and watched the tide creep in and out like something breathing. At night, the loneliness came in waves. I'd sit on the floor, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, scrolling through old photos I should have deleted. There was one of Daniel and me from our honeymoon, his hand on my waist, the ocean behind us. I'd stared at it for hours once, trying to see if I'd looked happy. I couldn't tell. The first week felt like detoxing from a drug. Every sound felt too loud, every silence too heavy. I kept reaching for my phone to check his messages, even though I knew they'd stopped long ago. But slowly, something shifted. The quiet stopped feeling like punishment. It began to feel like space, room enough to breathe, to think, to be. There was a cafe in town, a tiny place with peeling blue paint and a bell that jingled every time the door opened. The woman behind the counter, Nora, had a laugh that sounded like gravel and warmth mixed together. "You're new here," she said the first morning, handing me a cup of coffee. New people always stare at the sea like it's going to give them an answer. "Maybe it will," I said, managing a small smile. She grinned. "Maybe it already has." We became quiet acquaintances. She never asked where I came from, or why I flinched when I heard men's voices too loud in a room. She just poured coffee, talked about the weather, and told me which bread was best when you were feeling heart-hungry. Sometimes I sat near the window, notebook open, pen hovering over the page. I hadn't written in years, not since I traded my words for Daniel's vision of perfection. But here, the words began to return, hesitant at first, then unstoppable. The first line I wrote was simple. Truth begins when silence ends. After that, the dam broke. I filled pages with fragments, memories, reflections, half-formed essays. I wrote about the way ambition can wear love like a mask, about how women disappear inch by inch in the shadow of the men they believe in, about how guilt feels like glass under bare feet, cutting, but strangely clarifying. One afternoon, Nora came over as I was scribbling by the window. "You're a writer," she said matter-of-factly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I used to be," I said. She nodded. "Then you still are. Writers don't stop. They just go quiet." The town was full of small rituals. Fishermen mending their nets by the docks, children racing across the wet sand, the wind always carrying the smell of salt and old wood. I began to find comfort in their rhythm. One morning, I watched an older man fixing a torn fishing net. He worked slowly, looping and pulling the twine with patient hands. "Doesn't it get tiring?" I asked. He looked up, squinting against the light. "Only if you think of it as starting over," he said. "It's not starting over, it's keeping things together." That stayed with me. Maybe healing wasn't about rebuilding. Maybe it was about mending what was left. Thread by thread, piece by piece. By the third month, I'd sent out a few freelance pitches under a pseudonym. To my surprise, one of them got accepted, an essay titled The Cost of Perfection. It wasn't about Daniel directly. It was about the illusion of having everything. The house, the husband, the flawless life. and the silent rot that comes with it. I didn't use names, but anyone who'd lived behind glass would recognize the truth. When it was published, it spread quietly across online forums. Strangers wrote messages, some thanking me, some sharing their own stories. I realized then that anonymity could be its own kind of freedom. I was invisible to the world, but for the first time, I was seen. Still, Daniel's shadow lingered. In the grocery store checkout line, I saw his face on a magazine cover, standing beside Elise, both of them smiling under the headline, "Power Couple Expands Luxury Empire." My hand trembled slightly as I put the magazine back. The photo looked staged, but I could see it. The same emptiness in his eyes, the same performance. The empire was growing, yes, but it was hollow. I could almost hear the echo of his voice saying, "You wouldn't survive without me," and yet, there I was, alive, writing, healing, anonymous and unafraid. I walked back to the cottage that evening and stood on the porch, watching the sea darken under the setting sun. The horizon burned gold and rose, the same colors that used to shimmer through the glass house at dusk. I thought of my ring sinking in his bourbon, of the silence that followed, of how endings, like tides, never stop returning as beginnings. For the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt ready, not for revenge, something deeper. Justice, perhaps, or truth, reclaimed in my own voice. The waves hissed against the rocks, the sky folded into indigo, and I whispered into the wind, half promise, half prayer. I'm coming back. But not as who I was. It started with a whisper of instinct, one I almost ignored. I was sitting at the cafe, the smell of roasted beans and salt water curling together, when an email pinged my phone. It was from a shared account Daniel and I once used for managing his company's PR. I hadn't checked it in months. The subject line was plain: quarterly expense reconciliation. Old habits die hard. I clicked. At first it looked harmless. Spreadsheets, invoices, the usual glossy numbers Daniel liked to surround himself with. But then I saw my name, my full legal name, listed as co-signer on a corporate transfer to a company I'd never heard of. Another, then another. Over a dozen transactions, routed through offshore accounts, all tied to something called Emerald Capital Holdings. Emerald. The word hit me like static. The necklace. The one that wasn't meant for me. I stared at the screen, my pulse thudding in my ears. Slowly, I began piecing it together. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had used me. My name, my signature, my reputation, buried inside his empire like a quiet insurance policy. If anyone ever looked into his finances, I would be the one holding the smoking gun. For a moment, panic clutched me. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the phone. I'd left that world behind. I wanted peace, not another war. But peace built on a lie wasn't peace. It was paralysis. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sea outside roared louder than usual, slamming against the shore as if echoing the chaos inside me. I got up, lit a candle, and opened my old laptop, the one I'd used back when I was still a journalist. The keys felt familiar beneath my fingertips, like touching a past version of myself. And just like that, Amelia the wife became Amelia the reporter again. It took weeks to piece the puzzle together. I combed through archived emails, backup drives, and old event photos where Daniel stood smiling beside people I now knew were investors. Men and women whose trust he'd built with the same charm he once used on me. The deeper I went, the darker it became. I found invoices billed to companies that didn't exist, receipts for properties under aliases, and a trail of digital fingerprints leading back to shell corporations, all funded by money meant for sustainable developments, except the money never reached those projects. Every document bore his signature, and mine. The first time I saw my forged approval, I actually laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Of course he'd use me. I was perfect cover, the silent, polished wife who smiled on cue. But laughter turned to something colder. I printed everything, marked connections with red ink until my desk looked like a map of bloodlines. Every line, every name, Every date became a thread in the web he'd spun. When I finally stepped back, I realized I wasn't looking at my husband's success story. I was looking at a fraud empire, polished with mirrors, held up by deceit. And I was done being one of his mirrors. One afternoon, I told Nora. She was cleaning the espresso machine when I slid a folder across the counter. "You're not just hiding from him," she said after reading the first few pages. "You're holding the match that could burn down everything he built." "I don't want to burn it," I said quietly. "I just want the truth to breathe again," Nora nodded, understanding without questions. "Then you'll need someone who knows how to make the truth loud." That's how I reconnected with Michael Rivera, a journalist I'd once admired. Back when I was still the woman who chased stories, not avoided them, I emailed him under an alias, attaching one document, just enough to catch his attention. He replied within hours. "If this is real, we need to talk, but not online." We met in a crowded cafe 2 towns over, both of us wearing sunglasses like it was a spy movie. When he saw me, his jaw dropped slightly. "Amelia Brooks, I thought you'd vanished." "I did," I said. "Now I need to unvanish." He listened as I laid out the files, page after page. At first his expression was skepticism, then disbelief, then something close to fury. This is criminal," he whispered. "He's laundering investor money through your identity. If this goes public, he's finished." I shook my head. "Not yet. I want this done right. No headlines until it's airtight," Michael agreed. We spent weeks verifying, cross-checking, building a timeline strong enough to withstand Daniel's army of lawyers. Each night, I'd walk home from Nora's cafe with a folder tucked under my arm, my steps steady, my heartbeat calm. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. Around the same time, one of my anonymous essays, The Architecture of Betrayal, went viral. It was a meditation on how people construct illusions to protect themselves from truth, how love can be a kind of architecture built with denial as its foundation. Readers flooded the comments with empathy, but those who really knew began whispering. Investors, executives, people from Daniel's circle. I started getting emails from anonymous addresses. "Is this about Brooks Industries?" I never confirmed. I didn't have to. The silence after my essay spoke louder than confession. A week later, a headline appeared in a financial journal. "Whispers of irregularities in Brooks Industries accounting." I didn't write it. I didn't have to. The empire began to crack. Daniel's press photos started to change. His smile tighter, his eyes restless. Elise stopped appearing beside him in glossy spreads. I knew because Nora kept every magazine she could find, dropping them in front of me with a wry grin. "Looks like the king's losing sleep," she'd say. One morning, I caught my reflection in the cafe window. The woman looking back at me wasn't the polished ornament Daniel had sculpted. My hair was sun-streaked, my clothes simple, my skin unpainted. But my eyes, there was a steadiness there I hadn't seen in years. Fire. Not fury, but purpose. When Michael sent me the final draft of the exposé, it was meticulous. Every figure, every quote, every source verified. We agreed it would publish under his byline, but I'd write an accompanying essay, my first under my real name in years. The title came to me easily. When glass breaks, light gets in. It wasn't about Daniel. It was about me, about every woman who'd been silenced by love disguised as power. That night, before we went live, I sat by the sea. The wind tugged at my hair, and I could taste salt on my lips. I thought of the glass house, how Daniel once said it symbolized openness. How, in truth, it had been a cage. Now, I was the one opening the windows. The exposé broke 3 days later. It spread like wildfire, across finance networks, social media, TV panels. Words like fraud, embezzlement, identity misuse flashed beside Daniel's name. Investors pulled out. Partners resigned. By the end of the week, authorities announced an official investigation. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity. When Michael called to tell me the story had gone international, I was walking barefoot along the shore, the waves cold against my ankles. "You did it," "Amelia," he said. "No," I replied softly. "I just told the truth. It did the rest." Later that evening, I stood before the mirror in my cottage, the same mirror that had once reflected a woman unrecognizable in her own skin. Now, I looked at myself, unpolished, unafraid. I traced the faint lines at the corners of my eyes, the quiet strength in my jaw. For years, I'd worn beauty like armor. Now I wore honesty like a crown. I remembered Daniel's voice telling me, "You wouldn't survive without me." I smiled at my reflection. "Watch me," I whispered. When the story broke, I was watching the tide pull away from the shore, the same steady rhythm that had filled my morning since I left him. The sea was calm that day, gray and glassy, but my phone buzzed against the windowsill like a wasp trapped in a jar. Daniel Cole's empire under investigation for fraud and misrepresentation. The headline flashed across the screen, and for a moment I just stared. The words didn't sting the way I thought they might. They didn't even feel real. Instead, I felt something quieter, a release, like an exhale I'd been holding for years. The man who once controlled every corner of my life, from what I wore to who I was allowed to be, was finally facing the truth. Not my truth, the truth. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the waves roll in as the television in the corner played the chaos of the world I'd escaped. Reporters stood outside his glass towers, their voices sharp with excitement, cameras pointed like weapons. His name was on every channel, his smile, that polished politician's smile, frozen behind headlines that bled red with scandal. I should have felt vindicated. Maybe even victorious. But instead I felt still. The sea outside was steady, the same as it had been yesterday, and the day before that, the same as it would be tomorrow. The world was burning, and yet my little cottage smelled of salt and bread and morning light. When the phone rang again, I almost didn't answer. But I knew that voice. I'd know it anywhere. "Amelia," he said. His tone clipped, trembling at the edges. "What did you do?" The sound of his voice didn't pierce me anymore. It used to, like glass, sharp and familiar. But now it was dull, a relic from a life I'd already buried. "I told the truth," I said quietly. "You ruined me." He spat. His voice rose, frantic, desperate. "You don't understand what you've done!" "Everything I built, everything we built," I closed my eyes. "You built lies, Daniel. I just stopped covering for them." There was a long silence, then a laugh, bitter, hollow. "You think you're innocent? You were part of it. Your name's on the contracts. Do you even realize that?" "Yes," I said. "That's why I did it." For the first time in our entire marriage, I heard him falter. The air between us went cold. I imagined him standing in his office, blinds drawn, phone pressed to his ear. The empire he'd worshipped crumbling around him. "You think they'll believe you?" he whispered. "You think they'll make you a hero?" "I don't need to be a hero," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "I just needed to stop being your ghost." He hung up without another word. The silence that followed was absolute. I set the phone down on the table, next to the silver pendant that once had been my wedding ring. It gleamed softly in the morning light, not as a symbol of love, but as proof that even something melted down could be remade. The days that followed felt surreal. News anchors dissected every inch of his downfall. Analysts argued over numbers. And photographs of Elise, once the face of his family brand, vanished from every company site overnight. It turned out she'd left him quietly. A week before the investigation went public, she took nothing, not even the house he'd given her. Perhaps she finally saw what I had long ago, that the man who promised the world was, at his core, a hollow monument to himself. When the subpoena arrived, I wasn't surprised. My hands didn't even shake as I opened the envelope. "You are requested to testify in the case of the state versus Daniel Cole." The words looked clean, clinical, so unlike the chaos they carried. I sat at the table for a long time, tracing the lines of the letter, until Nora, the cafe owner who'd become my unlikely friend, knocked at the door. "You okay?" she asked, holding a basket of freshly baked rolls. "I will be," I said, and I meant it. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, in atmosphere. It was the kind of cold that came from judgment, from the silent thrill of watching someone powerful fall. When I walked in, I felt hundreds of eyes follow me. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, whispers rippled, but I kept my gaze forward. I wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry except the small silver pendant around my neck. He was there, Daniel, sitting beside his lawyer, jaw tight, eyes burning with disbelief. The man who once commanded boardrooms now looked smaller, thinner, as though the light that once followed him had finally turned away. Our eyes met, just once. There was recognition there, but not of love, of defeat. The prosecutor asked me to take the stand. My palms rested on the wooden railing, the scent of varnish sharp in the air. "Mrs. Cole," the attorney began. "Ms. Hart," I corrected softly. He nodded. "Ms. Hart, can you tell the court in your own words what you discovered?" And I told them. Everything. About the false accounts, the shell companies, the hidden transfers, all under my name. About the trust he'd broken. Not just as a husband, but as a partner, as a man who believed he was untouchable. Every word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When they presented the documents, the ones I had gathered, organized and protected for months, the courtroom fell silent. Even his defense lawyer hesitated before flipping through the pages. Daniel stared at me, disbelief giving way to something rawer, fear. For years I'd been the quiet one, the one who smiled through the lies, who stood beside him at galas, who laughed when he made cruel jokes to keep the illusion alive. Now I was the one holding the truth. When the verdict came, it was almost anticlimactic. Guilty, on multiple counts of fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. The words echoed, but I felt only stillness. As I stepped outside the courthouse, sunlight spilled across the marble steps. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward. "Amelia, did you know about the fraud? Was this revenge? Do you have anything to say to your husband?" I paused, looked at them, and smiled. Just a small, steady smile. "My name," I said, "is Amelia Hart." Then I walked away. That evening, I returned to the cottage. The sun had already begun to sink, painting the water in molten gold. I sat by the window, the same place I'd sat the morning the story broke, and let the silence fill the room. The old journal lay open on the table, the one I'd started writing in when I first arrived by the sea. I turned to the first page and began to write. "Freedom is quiet," I wrote. "It doesn't announce itself. It just waits for you to notice it." I closed the book gently. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and distant rain. I opened the window, let the sea breeze in, and placed the silver pendant on the sill. It caught the light, a single point of brightness in the fading dusk. For years, I had defined myself by what I'd lost: the marriage, the trust, the illusions. But as the waves rolled in, I realized something profound. What remained was mine. My words, my truth, my name. Somewhere, miles away, Daniel's empire was crumbling, his lawyers scrambling, his name sinking beneath the tide of scandal. But that was no longer my story. Mine was here, in the rhythm of the sea, the scent of morning coffee, the soft hum of a life rebuilt from ashes. I reached for the pendant and fastened it around my neck. It felt cool against my skin, light, alive. Once, it had been a symbol of bondage, a ring buried in bourbon, tarnished by lies. Now it was something else entirely, not a memory of him, a reminder of me. The waves whispered outside, steady, endless, and I let the wind take the last remnants of his voice.